if you recall from econ in college, GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so these are the four cylinders for GDP growth. Now, personal consumption expenditures is the key to economic growth. And why is that? Because personal spending is 70% of GDP. So the growth rate here is what's critical to the overall GDP growth figure. Whereas investment is about 14% of GDP. Government spending is 18% of GDP, and net exports is de minimis. It's 3% of GDP. So here's the key takeaway, I think. What's happening is, and the reason we're having lackluster GDP growth, at least by the post-World War II comparison of 3 to 3.5% GDP growth, is it looks like consumer spending has downshifted from a run rate last decade of something 2.5%, 3% to this decade post-recession a little bit more than 1%, maybe 1.5%. You see that we've lost a full percentage point from the growth rate in personal spending, and this is a direct result of sluggish job growth and sluggish wage gains. The other big piece of the private sector of the economy has been growing at a pretty normal rate most recent quarter. And in fact, investment was up 1.5% quarter over quarter annualized. And so one key takeaway from a detailed analysis of what's behind the GDP figure is that the private sector of the economy, not talking about exports particularly because it's such a small thing and it's also very volatile, is private sector economic growth was 2.5% in the quarter. So that has been running along at a healthy clip, not gangbusters, but healthy enough, and pretty consistently. Now, the government account has been very moribund. And in fact, government spending has not been contributing anything to GDP growth for quite some time now, but that's due to the sequester, but more importantly, that's been particularly due to local government downsizing. Department of Defense spending cuts, that again is a direct result of sequester spending cuts, has been very significant. Actually, that's a good thing, because I think the way they calculate GDP is a little bit wacky. To suggest that government consumption is a part and parcel of a measurement of total economic output is ridiculous. The private sector's doing just fine. It would be nice if consumer spending were growing a full percentage point faster, but nonetheless, as you see in this chart, if you again look behind the aggregate GDP figure, C plus I plus G, well, the C plus I, the private sector part, which is 85% of the economy, has actually been growing at a pretty good clip, pretty consistent with the historic pattern. And government spending has been a key takeaway, a key dampener, a key lag. Government spending is 18% of the GDP, and that has been consistently taking away. Although what you're seeing here, I think, is a troughing. And so I think probably going forward, government spending won't continue to be a takeaway. So here is the big picture of GDP growth, and you can see that over the last 3 years, compound annual growth rate over the last 3 years, that's what the footnote refers to, GDP growth has been 2.1% compared to the historic long-term 3%. So it's been below trend, but the key takeaway has been it has been sufficient to drive healthy earnings growth, and that's the key to stocks. Now, one step further is that, well, if you strip out that 18% represented by government consumption, as a matter of fact, the picture looks pretty dramatically improved from that previous picture. GDP growth has been recovering over the last 3 years at a compound annual growth rate of 3.2%, which is precisely in line with the long-term private sector ex-government GDP growth rate.